Dr. Marcus Everly's head throbbed as consciousness returned. The antiseptic smell hit him first, sharp and chemical, yet somehow different from any hospital he'd visited. His eyelids felt heavy, but he forced them open, blinking against the strange violet light that filled the room. "Subject is conscious," announced a melodic voice. Marcus tried to sit up but found his limbs restrained by some kind of transparent material, not quite solid, not quite liquid. Panic surged through him as memories flooded back, the strange lights above his research facility, the sensation of being lifted, the momentary weightlessness before darkness claimed him. "Where am I?" His voice sounded hoarse, unfamiliar. A figure stepped into his field of vision, and Marcus forgot how to breathe. It was definitely a she, despite the otherworldly features, stood tall and elegant, her skin a pale blue silver that seemed to shimmer under the violet lights. Her eyes were large, almond-shaped, and entirely black except for flecks of silver that appeared to move like stars in a night sky. No hair crowned her head, but instead, a series of delicate ridges that formed an intricate pattern down to her neck. "You are in Research Facility Epsilon, under the jurisdiction of the Valeran Empire," she replied, her tone clinical as she checked something on a translucent tablet. "I am Talia, senior xenobiologist assigned to Study Protocol 7 Alpha." "Study Protocol?" Marcus struggled against his restraints. "I'm a scientist, not a lab rat." A slight tilt of her head was the only indication she found his response interesting. "On your planet, perhaps. Here, you are specimen H-42. She made another note. "Your aggressive response is consistent with previous human subjects." "Previous subjects?" Horror washed over him. "You've taken others?" 17 to date. None have demonstrated the adaptability we seek." She moved closer, studying him with those unsettling star-filled eyes. "Your profile suggested greater potential. Your work in evolutionary biology shows remarkable insight for a species at your development stage." Despite his fear, professional pride made Marcus bristle. "If you've studied my work, you know I'm more valuable as a collaborative researcher than a test subject." For the first time, something flickered across Talia's face, surprise, perhaps. She set down her tablet and approached his containment field. "Interesting. You propose collaboration rather than pleading for freedom." Her voice remained even, but her posture had changed subtly. "Elaborate. Release these restraints, explain what you're looking for, and I'll help you understand humans better than any passive observation could." Marcus held her gaze, hoping his gamble would pay off. "I'm guessing if you're taking specimens, you have some interest in Earth." "I know my species better than you ever could." Talia considered him for a long moment. Then she pressed something on her wrist, and the restraints liquefied, flowing away from his limbs. "This is unprecedented," she stated as Marcus slowly sat up. "The Research Council will not approve." "Then don't tell them," Marcus suggested, rubbing his wrists. "At least not until we produce results." Another flicker of expression. Was that amusement? "You suggest deception for mutual benefit. How very human." She extended a long-fingered hand with an extra joint. "The observation chamber has been prepared for long-term habitation. I will escort you there." As Marcus cautiously took her hand to stand, he noticed how warm her skin felt against his, almost feverish. He wobbled slightly, and her grip tightened. "Your physiology is still adjusting to our atmosphere," Talia explained, steadying him. "The effects will fade." "What exactly do you want from humans?" Marcus asked as they moved toward a doorway that spiraled open at their approach. Talia's gaze seemed to penetrate through him. "Resilience. Your species survives when logic suggests you should perish. You adapt when adaptation seems impossible." For an instant, her professional mask slipped. "The Valeran Empire faces extinction unless we can understand this quality." In that moment of vulnerability, Marcus saw beyond the alien scientist to someone desperate to save her people. Despite everything, he felt a strange connection forming, two scientists facing an impossible problem together. "Then let's get to work," he said, stepping through the doorway into his new reality. 2 weeks into his captivity, Marcus found himself actually looking forward to Talia's daily visits. The observation chamber, a spacious suite that mimicked Earth environments with uncanny accuracy, had become less of a prison and more of a shared laboratory. "Your heart rate increases by 12% when I enter the room," Talia noted one morning, studying her monitors as she set down a tray of food samples. "Are you still experiencing stress responses to my presence?" Marcus smiled, taking a fruit that resembled a blue peach. "That's not stress, Talia. It's anticipation." "Anticipation?" She tilted her head in that way he'd come to find endearing. "Of our research sessions?" "Of seeing you," he clarified, watching her carefully. The slight shimmer that passed across her silvery blue skin told him she wasn't as emotionally detached as she pretended. He'd been cataloging her micro-expressions, learning to read her just as thoroughly as she studied him. Talia busied herself adjusting something on her tablet. "Such responses are irrelevant to our work." "Are they?" Marcus approached her, closer than protocol allowed. "You're studying human resilience. Our emotional connections are fundamental to that resilience." Her star-flecked eyes met his. "The Research Council believes emotions are evolutionary weaknesses." "Then the Research Council is wrong." He gestured to the data flowing across her screens. "Look at my cortisol levels during our problem-solving exercises. They drop when we work together, even on the most challenging tasks." Talia's gaze lingered on the readings. "It's anomalous. It's human." Marcus dared to touch her arm. "We draw strength from connection." She didn't pull away. Instead, she asked, "Is this why your previous relationships were unsuccessful? Your file indicates 3 failed pair bonds." Marcus laughed softly. "You read my dating history?" All available data was collected. Was that embarrassment in her voice? "My failed pair bonds ended because we weren't right for each other," he explained. "Humans need more than biological compatibility. We need understanding, challenge, mutual respect. These criteria seem inefficient for species propagation," Talia observed, but her tone had softened. Marcus shrugged. "Maybe that's why we fascinate you. We don't always do what's efficient. We do what feels right." For several moments, they stood in silence, her arms still beneath his fingertips, the contact sending warmth through both of them. "I've brought something unauthorized," Talia finally said, reaching into her sleek uniform. She withdrew a small device and handed it to him. "Earth music. I thought it might provide psychological comfort." Marcus turned the crystal-like object in his hand, deeply touched by this small rebellion. "This breaks protocol, doesn't it?" "Many of our interactions now break protocol," she admitted. "I deleted surveillance recordings of our conversation about Earth's literature yesterday. And the day before, I adjusted your nutrient formulae for taste rather than optimal nutrition." "Talia." He stepped closer. "Why?" Her eyes dropped to his lips briefly before meeting his gaze. "Your hypothesis about connection. I find myself conducting a parallel study." The admission hung between them, charged with possibility. "Computer, activate sound isolation," Talia suddenly commanded. "Sound isolation engaged," responded the room's AI. "Duration?" "Until manually disengaged." Talia's voice had taken on a new quality, less measured, more urgent. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, though something in him already knew. "Creating conditions for experimental honesty." She moved toward him with fluid grace. "When I report to the council tomorrow, I will present only selected data. They need not know everything we discover together." Her hands rose to frame his face, her extra-jointed fingers cool against his skin. Your physiological responses to me, they're reciprocated. I experience similar anticipation. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This could complicate your research. It already has. The admission seemed to cost her something. I've never failed to maintain scientific detachment before. But with you, objectivity seems impossible. He covered her hands with his own. Then stopped trying. The first touch of her lips against his sent an electric current through his body. She tasted like nothing on earth, sweet with an edge of spice that made his head spin. Her mouth was warmer than her hands, and when he deepened the kiss, she made a sound that was definitely not clinical. When they finally separated, the stars in her eyes seemed to pulse with new intensity. This is unprecedented, she whispered. The best discoveries usually are. Marcus pulled her closer, reveling in how perfectly her body fit against his despite their differences. Talia hesitated. If the council discovers this breach, then we'll be careful. He traced the delicate ridges along her head, watching in fascination as they flushed a deeper blue at his touch. Some research requires privacy. Yes, she agreed, her voice dropping to a seductive timbre he'd never heard from her before. And thorough documentation. As her hands began to explore him with scientific precision and decidedly unscientific intent, Marcus realized that captivity had taken an unexpected turn. He was no longer just a specimen, he was becoming something far more dangerous to the Valeran Empire's plans, a variable they hadn't accounted for. And as Talia's uniform slipped from her shoulders, revealing the luminescent patterns that traced across her silvery skin, he knew with certainty that she was no longer just an observer. She was becoming his ally in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The music device lay forgotten as they conducted their own research into the resilience of connection across the stars. Talia's quarters were strictly off-limits to research specimens, which made it all the more thrilling when she smuggled Marcus into her personal living space under the cover of a facility-wide systems diagnostic. The council meeting ran longer than expected, she explained, securing the door behind them. They're growing impatient for conclusive results. Marcus took in the surroundings. The space was minimal yet elegant, with curved surfaces and materials that seemed to absorb and emit light simultaneously. What caught his attention, however, were the small earth objects displayed carefully on a floating shelf, a paperback book, a seashell, a vinyl record. Souvenirs, he asked, touching the book, Shakespearean sonnets. Research artifacts, Talia corrected, though her expression softened. Though I've always found human artistic expression compelling. She approached him from behind, her hands sliding around his waist, her body pressing against his back. The weeks of secret meetings had transformed her from the cold scientist who'd first examined him. Now, her touch was confident, possessive. I've been reading your file again, she murmured against his neck, her breath warm. Your research on evolutionary adaptations to environmental stress. It's remarkable how closely it aligns with our current crisis. Marcus turned in her arms. You still haven't told me exactly what this crisis is. Something flickered across her face, hesitation, perhaps even fear. Some knowledge is dangerous, Marcus. More dangerous than abducting scientists from other planets. He brushed his fingers along the ridges of her head, watching them flush blue at his touch. It was a move he knew would distract her, weaken her resolve. She sighed, leaning into his caress. The Valeran atmosphere is degrading. Our scientists have tried everything, but our physiology cannot adapt quickly enough. We're losing fertility rates, lifespans are shortening. And humans adapt faster, Marcus concluded. That's why you're studying us. Yes. She pulled away, moving to a hidden panel in the wall. But there's more. The panel slid open to reveal a secured terminal. Talia pressed her palm against it, then hesitated. What I'm about to show you violates every security protocol. If discovered, it would mean execution for both of us. Marcus felt a chill. Then why risk it? Her star-filled eyes met his. Because what's developing between us has made me question everything I believed about my mission. She pressed her palm more firmly, and the terminal illuminated with classified files. Project Genesis, she said as images appeared, detailed scans of Earth, biological profiles of thousands of humans, terraforming models. The Empire doesn't just want to understand human adaptability. They want to harness it. Horror dawned on Marcus as he understood. They're planning to colonize Earth. Not colonize, Talia corrected grimly. Replace. The plan is to introduce atmospheric changes to Earth that would be lethal to humans but perfect for Valorans. Your species' extinction would be collateral damage. Marcus stepped back, his mind racing. The previous 17 subjects? Test cases to understand how humans respond to our atmospheric compounds. None survived the final trials. Her voice broke slightly. I didn't know the full scope when I began. By the time I accessed these files, I'd already. She trailed off. Already what? Marcus pressed. Talia stepped toward him, closing the distance he'd created. Already fallen in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, more dangerous than any classified information. Instead of responding verbally, Marcus pulled her into a kiss that was both tender and desperate. Her body responded immediately, molding against his as though their different biologies were irrelevant details in the face of their connection. They moved toward her sleeping platform, a hovering surface that adjusted to their combined weight. Clothing fell away as their urgency grew, his earth-made garments and her Veilran uniform discarded without ceremony. We need to warn Earth, Marcus whispered against her skin as she straddled him, her luminescent body patterns pulsing with arousal. We will, she promised, guiding him into her. The sensation of their bodies joining sent waves of pleasure through them both, alien yet perfectly complementary. Their lovemaking had a new intensity, fueled by the danger of their situation and the weight of their shared knowledge. Talia's controlled demeanor dissolved completely as she rode him, her head thrown back, star eyes blazing with passion. Marcus gripped her hips, mesmerized by how her skin's luminescence synchronized with the rhythm of their movements, growing brighter with each thrust. I never imagined, she gasped, that biological union could transcend physical sensation. Marcus pulled her down to kiss her deeply. That's the resilience you've been studying, he murmured against her lips. Love is humanity's greatest adaptation. Their pace quickened, their bodies finding a perfect harmony despite their differences. When release finally came, it swept through them simultaneously, a cosmic connection that left them trembling and breathless. Afterward, as they lay intertwined, the reality of their situation returned with sobering clarity. The next phase of Project Genesis begins in 3 cycles, Talia said quietly, tracing patterns on his chest. Earth's atmosphere will receive the first microbursts of Veilran compounds. Marcus sat up, his scientist's mind already working through possibilities. Then we have 3 cycles to stop it. Or less, Talia warned. Once I fail to deliver promised results from your study, they'll reassign me and most likely terminate you. He cupped her face, suddenly struck by what she was sacrificing. You're betraying your entire civilization for me, for Earth. The stars in her eyes seemed to dim slightly. I'm choosing a moral path over blind loyalty. My people's survival doesn't justify genocide. She kissed him softly. And yes, I'm choosing you. The first being who saw me as more than a collection of data points and protocols. Marcus pulled her close, his mind already formulating an escape plan. With access to her security clearance and his understanding of both species' biology, they might have a chance, slim, but real. Tomorrow, he whispered into the curve of her neck, we begin our counter-project. Talia nodded against him, her body still glowing faintly from their intimate connection. "I've already disabled the tracking in your biometric implant," she confessed. "And downloaded the shuttle bay access codes." Marcus smiled against her skin. "Who's the adaptive species now?" Her soft laugh was the most human sound he'd ever heard from her. "Your biological signs indicate extreme stress," Talia observed as she entered the observation chamber with her usual tablet. The room's surveillance was active, so they maintained their researcher-subject dynamic. "Nightmares," Marcus replied, following their carefully rehearsed script. "I keep dreaming about home." Talia made a note, her face professionally neutral despite the concern in her eyes. "I'll adjust your sleep cycle regulation. Perhaps a deeper phase will prevent the disruptions." What the surveillance couldn't detect was the data crystal she slipped into his hand during the brief contact of their routine medical scan, a crystal containing everything they needed for their escape. Later, with sound isolation engaged and surveillance looped to show him sleeping, Marcus studied the detailed schematics Talia had provided. The research facility was attached to a larger space station, which housed several interstellar shuttles. Their plan was audacious: use Talia's credentials to access a shuttle bay, program a course for the nearest neutral trading post, and from there, find passage to Earth. The door whispered open, and Talia slipped inside, immediately embracing him. "The Council has moved up the timetable," she said without preamble, her voice tight with urgency. "First atmospheric injections to Earth begin tomorrow, not in 3 cycles." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Why the change? Security concerns. Someone accessed the classified files on Project Genesis. She pressed her forehead against his. "They don't know it was me yet, but they're running trace protocols." "Then we leave tonight," Marcus decided, gripping her shoulders. Talia nodded. "I've prepared medical packets with compounds that will help you survive Veilran environments. And this," she pressed a small device into his palm, "will temporarily mask your biosignature as Veilran. It won't withstand close inspection, but it should get you past basic security scans." As the reality of their plan solidified, Marcus realized what Talia was sacrificing: her career, her standing, potentially her life. For him. For a planet she'd never even visited. He pulled her close, breathing in her alien scent that had become so familiar, so beloved. "Come with me to Earth," he whispered against her skin. "Help me warn them. Your knowledge of Veilran technology could be the key to developing countermeasures." She stiffened slightly in his arms. "I hadn't considered survival on Earth. I've been studying your physiology as carefully as you've studied mine," Marcus smiled, tracing the luminescent patterns on her neck that pulsed faster when she was aroused. "The compounds you're giving me? I can reverse engineer something similar for you." Hope flickered across her features. "A life on Earth, with you. A life anywhere, as long as it's together," he promised. The intensity of the moment overwhelmed them both. Their lips met in a desperate kiss that quickly escalated. Clothes fell away as they made their way to his sleeping platform, their bodies already familiar with each other's most sensitive areas. Marcus laid Talia down reverently, his hands exploring the ridges along her sides that he knew would make her gasp. Her skin began to glow under his touch, the luminescence spreading in waves across her blue-silver surface. "If this is our last night here," she whispered, pulling him down to her, "let's make it memorable." Marcus kissed his way down her body, lingering at the places where her alien anatomy diverged most significantly from human, the sensitive gill-like structures at her ribcage, the intricate patterns at her inner thighs that intensified in color as he caressed them. He'd learned that the slight temperature difference between them created exquisite sensations for her when he used his mouth. Talia arched beneath him as he tasted her, her hands gripping his hair. The sweet spice flavor of her arousal had become his favorite taste in the universe. Her thighs trembled against his shoulders as he brought her to the edge, her luminescence flaring brightly. "Marcus," she gasped, tugging him upward. Join with me. Completely. He moved up her body, positioning himself between her legs. The connection of their bodies had become something transcendent, a perfect joining despite their different origins. As he entered her, the warm, pulsing embrace of her body welcomed him home. They moved together with practiced synchronicity, her extra-jointed limbs wrapping around him in ways no human lover could achieve. The room filled with their combined sounds, his deeper groans mixing with her melodic cries. I never knew, she whispered against his ear, that connection could be like this. That I could feel so, complete with another being. Marcus increased his pace, watching in wonder as her skin's glow matched his rhythm, brightening with each thrust. This is what we're fighting for, he managed between breaths. The right to choose who we love, who we become together. Their lovemaking grew more intense, fueled by the danger awaiting them and the knowledge that everything would change after tonight. When Talia's release came, the luminescence of her skin flashed so brightly it momentarily blinded him, her inner muscles pulsing around him in waves that triggered his own powerful climax. They held each other tightly as the aftershock subsided, their bodies cooling slowly in the controlled environment of the chamber. For hours until the shift change, Talia finally said, reluctantly pulling away. We should prepare. They dressed efficiently, gathering only what was essential. Talia had procured nondescript Veilran attire for Marcus that would help him blend in during their escape. As she adjusted the final settings on his biosignature mask, Talia suddenly looked vulnerable. I've never broken the law before, she admitted. Never even considered it. Marcus kissed her forehead, between the elegant ridges she'd once told him were a sign of intellectual lineage among her people. The truly resilient know when rules must be broken for something greater. She smiled at that. Using my own research against me. Learning from you, he corrected, taking her hand. Ready? Talia squared her shoulders, once again the confident scientist he'd first met, but now with a dangerous gleam in her star-filled eyes. Ready. As they disabled the final security measures and prepared to step into the corridor, Marcus felt a strange calm settle over him. No matter what awaited them, they would face it together, human and Veilran, united by something stronger than either of their species had anticipated. The door slid open, revealing their path to freedom, and to Earth's salvation. The corridor stretched before them, eerily quiet during the night cycle. Talia led the way, her movements confident as she navigated the labyrinthine facility. Marcus followed closely, his heart pounding against his ribs, the biosignature mask humming softly against his skin. 3 more junctions, Talia whispered, consulting her internal map of the station. Then we'll reach the shuttle bay. They rounded a corner and froze. 2 security officers stood conversing outside a laboratory, blocking their path. Talia pulled Marcus into an alcove, their bodies pressed together in the narrow space. Wait for my signal, she breathed against his ear. When they separate, we move. Minutes passed like hours as they remained motionless, barely breathing. Finally, one officer departed, leaving the other alone at his post. Talia's hand found Marcus's, squeezing once. She stepped out confidently, pulling him alongside her. Senior researcher Talia, the officer acknowledged with a respectful nod. Working late cycle? Final observations on the human subject, she replied smoothly. The council requested immediate results. The officer's gaze shifted to Marcus, lingering a moment too long. This specimen is permitted corridor access. By my authority, Talia stated firmly. The test requires environmental variation. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though sweat beaded at his temples. The officer studied him, then nodded slowly. Proceed, senior researcher. They continued past, maintaining an even pace until turning the corner. Only then did Marcus release his held breath. That was, he began. Alarm sirens cut him off, pulsing red light flooding the corridor. Security breach in Section 12, announced an automated voice. All personnel return to stations. Research specimens to be secured immediately. They've discovered the loop in surveillance, Talia realized, her composure cracking. Run. They abandoned stealth for speed, racing through the corridors toward the shuttle bay. Emergency barriers began descending from ceiling to floor, forcing them to slide beneath or find alternate routes. There. Talia pointed to a maintenance shaft. It bypasses the main corridor. They squeezed inside, climbing quickly through the narrow passage. The harsh sound of their breathing echoed in the confined space. The shuttle bay is one level down, Talia said as they reached a junction. This leads directly. The shaft beneath them suddenly opened, sending them tumbling into a room below. Marcus hit the floor hard, pain shooting through his shoulder. As his vision cleared, he found himself staring at a pair of ornate boots. "Senior researcher," said a cold voice. "Your experiment appears to have exceeded parameters." Research Director Vex stood before them, flanked by security officers. His elongated features held no emotion, but the pulse of deep crimson along his facial ridges betrayed his anger. Talia rose slowly, positioning herself between Marcus and Vex. "Director. I can explain." "Fascinating," Vex replied. "Explain how you accessed classified files. Or how you plan to steal Imperial property." His black eyes flicked to Marcus. "Both the shuttle and this specimen." "He's not property," Talia countered, her voice steady despite the danger. "None of them are. What we're doing to Earth, it's genocide." Vex sighed, as if disappointed. "It's survival, Talia. Ours or theirs." He gestured to the officers. "Secure the human for immediate termination. Researcher Talia will face the council for judgment." As the officers advanced, Marcus caught Talia's subtle movement, her hand slipping to her waist where a small device was concealed. "Now," she shouted, activating the device. The room plunged into darkness as every system simultaneously failed. Emergency barriers sealed automatically, trapping Vex and his officers on one side of the room while Marcus grabbed Talia's hand, following her through a side door that had briefly unlocked during the power fluctuation. "Station-wide shutdown," she explained as they sprinted down darkened corridors lit only by emergency strips. "It won't last long." They reached the shuttle bay just as systems began to reboot. Talia's access code still worked, opening the final door to their escape. The sleek shuttle waited, its systems already powering up as they approached. Talia had programmed it remotely hours earlier. They rushed inside, sealing the hatch behind them. "Initiating launch sequence," Talia announced, her fingers flying over the controls. "Vex will override the bay doors if we don't hurry." Marcus strapped himself in beside her, watching in awe as she piloted with practiced ease. The shuttle hummed to life, lifting from its berth. "Bay doors unresponsive," she reported tensely. "They've locked us in." Marcus scanned the controls, his scientific mind racing. "The emergency protocols, can we trigger them manually?" Talia's eyes widened in understanding. "If the system detects imminent engine breach, it automatically jettisons the affected craft." "Then let's give them a breach to detect," Marcus suggested, already accessing the engine controls. Together they created a carefully calibrated energy surge, enough to trigger alarms but not enough to cause actual damage. Warning lights flashed across the console as the station systems detected the apparent malfunction. "Prepare for emergency ejection," warned the station's automated voice. The bay doors slid open, and powerful magnetic fields propelled their shuttle into space, away from the station that had been both prison and sanctuary. As the stars stretched into streaks of light around them, Talia engaged the faster-than-light drive. The station grew smaller behind them until it vanished completely. "Course set for Earth," she confirmed, finally leaning back in her seat. "Estimated arrival, 12 days. Marcus unfastened his restraints and pulled her into his arms. We did it. Not yet, she cautioned. Vex will send pursuit ships. And once we reach Earth, we still need to warn your leaders, develop countermeasures. He silenced her with a gentle kiss. One impossible thing at a time. Talia laughed softly, the sound still new and precious. They moved to the small living quarters at the rear of the shuttle, where a viewing portal showed the endless cosmos streaming past. I've studied 17 humans before you, Talia said as they stood together, watching the stars. None of them made me question everything I believed. Marcus turned her to face him, his hands tracing the now familiar contours of her face. What made me different? The stars in her eyes seemed to pulse with emotion. You saw me. Not as an alien, not as a scientist. You saw me. Their bodies came together naturally, clothing discarded as they celebrated their freedom and faced their uncertain future the only way that made sense, in each other's arms. Talia's luminescence filled the small chamber as Marcus carried her to the sleeping platform, their bodies joining with now familiar perfection. Their lovemaking was slower this time, each savoring the other with the knowledge that they had time, days of travel ahead, potentially a lifetime beyond that. As they moved together, Marcus whispered against her glowing skin, whatever happens on Earth, however we deal with the Veilran threat, we'll face it together. Talia's body arched beneath him, her star eyes blazing with pleasure and something deeper. Together, she echoed, her voice breaking as sensation overtook her. Their shared climax felt like a promise, a new bond forming that transcended their different worlds, different biologies, different histories. Later, as they lay intertwined in the dimmed cabin, monitoring systems beeping softly around them, Talia traced patterns on Marcus's chest. I've been thinking about our research, she said. My people's atmospheric problem and Earth's coming threat, they're connected. What if the solution is also connected? Marcus considered this, the scientist in him engaged despite their exhaustion. A biological adaptation that could help both species survive? Precisely. Talia sat up, excitement building. The Veilran Council sees only conquest as the solution, but what if there's another way? A shared adaptation, a symbiosis between our worlds. As they began excitedly sharing ideas, sketching possibilities on the shuttle's data systems, Marcus realized they'd discovered something more valuable than escape. They'd found hope, for Earth, for the Valorans, and for themselves. Outside the viewport, stars continued streaming past as the shuttle carried them toward Earth. Inside, two beings from different worlds created something entirely new, a bridge between species, a love that defied categorization, and perhaps, if they succeeded, a future where both their civilizations could thrive. Not as conquerors and conquered, but as partners in the greatest adaptation of all, learning to see beyond differences to the connections that truly mattered.